I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about a subject that I think is of great importance. It is looking at the idea of whether or not juveniles should be treated the same way as adults in our criminal justice system. And I'll tell you, this is really important to me. My name is Shelley Grant, and I am an assistant professor of sociology and criminal justice at JU. And I worked in the juvenile justice system for 20 years. So this is really near and dear to my heart. And something that I've worked on for a long time, but I think it should be important to you as well, because it is something that we're still trying to answer to this day. We've been trying to answer this question since the 1800s, and we have changed our mind about the answers to the questions. We've thought differently about how we treat juveniles in our system, everything from treating them just like adults to treating them in a rehabilitative way, back to treating them like adults. And today we're still working on answering the question. So we're going to get started and talk about this really important subject. So the first thing we need to talk about just for a moment is just a few definitions. This isn't going to be a lecture on learning vocabulary, but just so that you have an understanding of some of the things that go on in our system, I wanted to go over just a few terms with you. So first, we have the word juvenile. That just means a young person. Usually we consider juveniles to be in the time of adolescence, which is that period of life that you all have been through when you start to develop into an adult, you start going through puberty, you start making decisions on your own, you start developing your identity, and typically puberty lasts not just until your state would say that you're an adult, so let's say 18 years old, but actually until you're really on your own and sustaining yourself. So something interesting about looking at adolescence in our day and age is that it lasts a lot longer than it used to, and that's going to become important as we talk through this lecture. So I want you to think about puberty probably starts younger than it used to. We can blame that on whatever we want, hormones and chicken or whatever we want. And it lasts longer because more and more people are continuing their education, not fully supporting themselves, not fully going into that world of being completely on your own until later. So that's going to become very important. So I want you to think about that period of adolescence as something that lasts a long time. And it's kind of a tumultuous time. So most of you, your years of adolescence, they were a little bit stressful. Things are going on with peers and with school that can be rather stressful. So developing your own identity and your own independence at the same time as that can be somewhat difficult. So we're going to talk about identity development just a little bit and how people mature and how their brain works when they're trying to mature. And then some children have extra added risk during their time of adolescence. So for all of us, it can be a rather stressful time, but for some young people, they have things that they are dealing with, such as abuse in their home, or living in a situation where they are living in extreme poverty, or they're struggling in school, or they're struggling because they live in a neighborhood where crime is high or violence is high, or they use substances. So I'm just listing a few examples of things that could make a youth at risk. So that puts them even at more vulnerability for maybe engaging in our criminal justice system, because they're already dealing with all of this stress and dealing with what happens during that period of adolescence, and then we compound that with other at-risk factors that cause them to struggle just a little bit more. And we can even include mental health disorders in the category of at-risk youth, because so many children who end up in our system do have mental health issues. And then when a youth actually officially breaks the law, before they become an adult, whatever that age is in the state that you live in Florida, it's 18, then they're considered a juvenile delinquent. So those are just the few terms that I wanted to make sure we had an understanding of before we jump in, because we do have separate systems. Our criminal justice system is different than our juvenile justice system, and we're going to talk about that just a little bit. They have very similar processes, but a little bit, different organizational structure in some ways. and we won't go into all the details about that, but some organizational differences. But the juvenile justice system, the big difference between it and the criminal justice system is the thought process behind why we have a juvenile justice system. So our juvenile justice process is meant to, reduce stigma, to not leave kids labeled in some way that's going to affect the rest of their lives negatively. The consequences of early and minor offending should be rather minimal so as not to label that child as some type of criminal so they have trouble getting jobs or going to college or joining the military, those kinds of things that can alter at a very young age the rest of their lives. We do a lot of things very similarly in the juvenile justice system that we do in the adult system. We just call them different things. So we try to give them names that, for lack of a better way of saying it, are a little bit nicer. So instead of indicting someone for a crime, we file a petition against a child. Instead of sending them to jail, we put them in a detention center. Instead of having a trial where you go in front of a judge and a jury, we call those hearings. And in the juvenile justice system, we actually don't have juries most of the time. Instead of convicting our youth, we adjudicate them. So some of these terms that sound rather harsh, like the last one, like incarceration, we don't send children to prison. We put them in what we call commitment facilities. So I want you to have this understanding that the terms seem softer, but some of the processes we use can have long-term effects on our children. Even though they sound a little bit different and they're a little bit softer sounding, they still have an impact, and they are still a child being put in a system that was originally created, our criminal justice system, originally created to punish people for their offenses. And so we're supposed to look at juvenile justice in a very, very different way. And so I want you to think about that as we move to our next slide, because we didn't create our juvenile justice system until the late 1800s. Our first juvenile court was actually not established until 1899, and then it took us about 25 more years for all of our states at the time to create their own juvenile justice systems. There were very good intentions with the original creation of juvenile justice, because what we wanted was children treated fairly, to treat children from the perspective of rehabilitation. If you look at the primary focus of our original juvenile justice system, we would have said that it was to work in the best interests of children. So you see nothing in there about punishment, about incarceration. None of those kinds of things were the original intent of our juvenile justice system. We wanted to be able to look at kids differently and individually and help take care of them and rehabilitate them. What happened was, for many years, and there's a big gap between that first bullet I have with 1899 and then the 1980s. That's a long time. So we had a lot go on during that time. We realized that children needed constitutional rights in our system, which they originally were not given, because we created the system to be so informal that we didn't really look at this idea of children needing constitutional rights, because we thought we were just helping them. But as we grew and learned and created more juvenile justice court systems, we realized that juveniles did need rights to due process and other constitutional rights that adults have. So we had a lot of kinks to work out, but still the basic premise was this idea that we were trying to work in the best interest of children. But in the 1970s, moving into the 1980s, and even into the early 1990s, we saw this huge rise in juvenile crime. This also happened in our adult system. So it wasn't just juveniles that started committing more crime. Even adults started committing more crime as well. So as a country, we kind of panicked. This coincided, if you're wondering why this happened in the 1990s, this coincided with increases in technology that caused high unemployment. At the same time that certain drugs like crack were entering our streets, gangs became more prevalent, which means gun availability became more prevalent. And murder was one of the crimes that was significantly on the rise. So our country panicked during this time, and because juveniles were often a part of gangs and a part of, drive-by shootings were making the news and things like that, we also panicked about juveniles. So When that happens, when our society panics about something, what do people do? They call their, you know, they call their local politicians, they call our law enforcement offices, they call our prosecutors' offices saying something has to be done. We're fearful. And so people became very fearful of children in the 1980s, to the point that we created a word called super predator to label children who engaged in violent crime. And super predator was a label that actually stuck. It made us very, very scared of children because a super predator doesn't really sound like someone you want to rehabilitate. It sounds like someone that you want to punish. And that name, it stuck so long that it actually was continued being discussed in our last presidential campaign, if that tells you how long, kind of a sticky negative label can last. So what we did in the 1980s, when we panicked and we felt like we needed to handle children more harshly because they were engaging in more violent offenses, is we changed our laws. What we did, we enabled, into the 1990s, we created this kind of tough on crime idea, and we made it easier to pull children from the juvenile justice system and place them back in our adult system. So now we're back to where we were in the 1800s when we were treating children, actually even as young as 8 to 10 years old, as adults. So the 1990s brought this wave of sending kids back into the adult system. And so these tough on crime laws allowed us not only to send them into the adult system, but treat them just like adults while they were in this system. So we put a lot of children in prison and let a lot of children receive what we call life without parole sentences. So if they did something harsh enough or violent enough, we could impose penalties on them that we would automatically impose on adults for the same crime. And so life without parole means that you go to prison for the rest of your life with no opportunity to be released. We also allowed the death penalty for juveniles, which meant that any 16 or 17-year-olds that were committed with certain crimes, they could receive the death penalty if a jury decided that they felt like that was warranted in the crime that they committed. We sent younger and younger children into our adult system. So prior to the 90s, to the 80s and 90s, we generally only sent older children who committed very, very serious offenses into our adult system. But with this fear and this panic that came in the late 80s and early 90s, we changed the laws so we could send kids into the adult system at much younger ages. In fact, many states removed any age limit as far as the youngest minimum age limit that children could be transferred into the adult system. So, we have had children as young as 12 that have been transferred into our adult system. We also opened up the types of crimes that children could be sent into the adult system for. So, prior to this time, only very serious, typically violent crimes would push a child into the adult system. We open that up to multiple types of crimes. So let's say a child committed multiple property crimes. Let's give an example, something like burglary. Multiple property crimes, these children could be pushed into the adult system. So we saw thousands of children being transferred into our adult system in the 80s and 90s and being sent to our adult jails and prisons, where they were not required by law to be separated from the adults in that system. So another side effect of that is we had a lot of children that were being sent to adult prisons and being seriously victimized or placed in solitary confinement for their own protection, which also damaged their mental health very greatly and created a lot of other issues in our jails and prisons. So by the 2000s, our Supreme Court jumped in, the U.S. Supreme Court, not a state Supreme Court, and said, okay, we need to think about some of those reactive decisions that we made in the 80s and 90s and see if the decisions that we made out of fear and panic, if they really have turned out to work the way that we wanted them to. Is that really why juveniles are committing less crime now? Is it really effective to punish a juvenile that harshly and expect then for them to come out on the other side as a productive citizen? So the Supreme Court started looking at these issues again. So you can see from this, it doesn't take very long. Very quickly in the 80s and 90s, we changed laws to make things harsher. but then it took us well into the 2000s before we started making decisions that might retract some of the decisions that we had made during that time. So what made the Supreme Court start thinking about this issue? Well, brain science. And I am not a natural scientist, I am a criminologist, but the really neat thing about criminology is it involves lots and lots of disciplines, even our natural sciences. And so brain science really progressed during these years. And things that we did not know at all when we made these decisions about how we were treating children in the 80s and 90s, we learned the impact it was having on them, and we learned maybe a little bit more about why they made the poor decisions that they made. So you can see on this slide that you can see how a child's brain progresses naturally. And as a child's brain progresses, a lot happens in really early years. So you can see the 5-year-old brain, and a lot of that happens really early on. But a lot happens in adolescence too. So about the time you hit puberty, your limbic system becomes really active. And your limbic system makes you more impulsive, makes you more of a risk taker, makes you have more mood swings. And this impacts adolescent behavior. So you can imagine if you're in puberty and you're having a lot of stress, or that there are risks in place for you, that your emotional brain is not going to be able to make great decisions. So I'm thinking back to when I was a teenager, and maybe for a minute you could think back when you were maybe going through puberty, so really young. And I don't know if you ever did anything that made your parents ask you the question, what were you thinking? But my parents definitely asked me that question when I was really young about some of the decisions I made. And I'm betting maybe your parents asked you some version of that question. And, you know, the answer to that question at the time might have been, well, I did it because I wanted my friends to like me, or I didn't have enough money and my friends told me that that store wouldn't catch me if I stole a shirt from them and I really wanted it. Or I was really angry at that person because they said something bad about me, or they said something bad about my friend. So those might have been the answers that you were thinking about in your mind as to why you engaged in behavior that was inappropriate at the time. And so really the question that your parents should have been asking you is, how were you thinking? So here's what goes on with the adolescent brain. So your limbic system is in full swing. You're very moody, you're very willing to take risks, you're very, very susceptible to peer pressure. I would also bet that that decision that you made, that your parents said, what were you thinking about, that you probably had other people with you when you made that decision. But we had no idea until the last couple of decades that it was really our brain causing us to make those decisions, until we could really start using magnetic resonance imaging, which is just an MRI, to get snapshots of the brain to see how the brain developed, that we really understood why adolescence causes so many people to make poor decisions. And so your prefrontal cortex, and again, this is not a science lesson, but your frontal lobe is the very last part of your brain to mature. And that's the part that lets you reason with yourself. That's the part that lets you make what we would call good decisions. It also lets you plan for the future. It inhibits, inappropriate behavior. It helps us with our social interactions and our self-awareness. And that part of the brain is not fully developed until you're about 26 years old. So maybe many of you listening to this lecture, you are thinking, well, my brain's not even fully developed yet. Well, that's true. But as you grow and as you get older, it becomes more and more developed. So many of you, as you're entering college, you're thinking about your futures. You're able to make more rational decisions. You can consider the consequences of your behaviors. You can think about what you say before you say it. And maybe you have a little bit more resistance to peer pressure because that frontal lobe is developing. But think about how long I told you adolescence lasts now. So we have the limbic system really kicking in as young as maybe 10 and 11 and 12 now, and then your frontal lobe not being fully developed till your mid-20s. So when you're in adolescence and you have to make a quick decision about whether or not you're going to engage in an activity with friends that could be detrimental to you, your brain is telling you to go for it. It's telling you to be risky. It's not letting you think about the future because the limbic system doesn't let us forward think. It's telling us that, all that's important right now is that our friends like us, or that you're upset and this person wronged you. And you're not thinking about the fact that I could get arrested. This could affect my career later on. This could affect my ability to get into college. So poor decision making is very, very common in adolescence. And it's even more common when children experience trauma or those risk factors that we talked about, and they're bombarding their brain as well. So your limbic system is so active and you're so hypersensitive to risk while things are still developing that you're very likely to make poor decisions. And we're far less likely to consider other people's perspectives than when we become an adult. Okay, so we're not even as worried about what other people are thinking about it as we do when we become adults, and how future bosses or future schools or even our parents would feel about the behavior that we're engaging in. Okay, so what does this mean for the juvenile justice system? It means that we really need to think about when an adolescent makes a decision that goes against our laws, how do we handle that? We can't look at them just like they're an adult, like a 28, 29, 30, 40, 50-year-old person, because their brain is not working the way that an adult brain works. So what we have to try to figure out is, how guilty are they? Since it's really their brain that's helping them make these poor decisions, culpability just means, how guilty are we? So now this doesn't mean that we don't look at public safety, or that we don't punish children for behaviors that they engage in that are wrong or that are illegal. But we have to think about what brought them to that place and how we can help them move from that place to a better place, instead of just thinking about we need to punish them and that will make them change their behavior, because that's not necessarily true. We can't make them have their brain develop faster. We can help them learn things about decision making, but we can't move their brain development along any faster. So we have to think about, how do we handle kids now? Just the fact that they are young and their brain's not fully developed means that we need to look at mitigation, which means that we kind of lessen the force of what they've done. So we're not looking so much at punishing them harshly in order to prevent that behavior from happening again. We actually know that doesn't work very well with children because their brain won't let it. So we have to look at ways that we can hold children responsible, but also potentially look at this idea that they probably deserve less punishment than a typical offender because of the brain science that we're aware of now. So when we punish people in our system, period, our criminal justice system or our juvenile justice system, we look at the idea that we need to look at the person who's committed the crime, the harm of the crime to society, so public safety. So what happened was, from the beginning of the creation of our juvenile justice system, this is what we were looking at. We said kids were less blameworthy. We need to treat them differently. We need to punish them less harshly. We need to rehabilitate them. And then when we became so fearful of children in the 80s and 90s, we lost sight of this. We said that juveniles were just as blameworthy as adults, that their young age was not necessarily a mitigation for them. And then the proportionality of how we handled their case in court said that we should punish them harshly, because we weren't considering the balance of guilt versus mitigation. So that's how we ended up sending lots and lots of kids into our adult system. When we knew that when we know now that they have deficiencies in decision making, and because of their brain, they're very vulnerable to being coerced. So another word for that all of you know is peer pressure. and their character's not fully formed. So they're not the person that they are eventually going to be when they're in adolescence. I don't know about you, but I can honestly say that I don't want to be judged on my 13-year-old self for the rest of my life. And basically, that's what we began doing. Very young children, we were pushing into an adult system that they did not understand, that was not built for them, and that assumed that they were the person they were always going to be. So in reaction to this, so this is how the Supreme Court got involved. This isn't to say, again, that we don't protect the public from people who are a danger to us, but our Supreme Court started looking at this idea of, how do we handle children that engage in serious offenses? And, I would ask you to think just a little bit about, do you believe that juveniles should receive the death penalty or the possibility of life without parole? And our Supreme Court has contemplated these ideas over the last couple of decades and come to some pretty significant conclusions. And, knowing what we know now about how children make decisions and how their brain works, we have to look very carefully at that balance between going back to the idea of the best interest of the child and then also looking at public safety. So the Supreme Court, they've made a lot of big decisions. They've decided that we no longer can give youth the death penalty. So juveniles can no longer receive the death penalty. That's the first case you see on this slide, Roper versus Simmons. So that was one of the first big decisions they made. 16 and 17-year-olds can no longer receive the death penalty. The Supreme Court actually considered it to be a violation of our 8th Amendment, which says that we cannot be exposed to cruel and unusual punishment. And the Supreme Court said because of the way a child's brain works, this is cruel and unusual. They moved from there. It took several more years for them to look at a case that actually came from Florida, and actually a local attorney here in Jacksonville got to argue this case in front of the Supreme Court. So that's kind of a neat thing. But in Graham versus Florida, the Supreme Court ended up deciding that no juveniles could get life without parole unless they committed murder. Prior to that, we had sent quite a few young people to prison for the rest of their lives for less than homicide cases. So cases like, robbery and sexual assault cases and other cases like that, we would send kids to prison for the rest of their life with no opportunity for release, regardless of rehabilitation or regardless of changing character. And then pretty quickly after Graham versus Florida, the Supreme Court said in Miller versus Alabama that we cannot automatically sentence a juvenile to life without parole, even for a homicide case, so even for murder. Now, that doesn't mean that a juvenile cannot go to prison for the rest of their life. It does not mean that we cannot sentence them to enough years that would equal the rest of their life if they committed something, a murder that was extremely heinous. It just means that our system has to recognize that kids are different and that we need to look at their case individually rather than as a whole or rather than as if they were an adult. And then give a meaningful opportunity at some point in the future that their case and their life and their situation would be looked at again to see if parole would be a possibility or if release would be a possibility at some later point in their life. And each state has to decide how long that is. And then the last important case happened just a few years ago, and basically Montgomery versus Alabama said that we have to go back to Miller versus Alabama and look at every single case prior to 2012 that we ever sentenced a child to life without parole for. So, the Supreme Court has made, these big decisions, and I would not ask you to make these big decisions without learning more and thinking more, but these are really important things that we need to talk about with kids and our system and how we treat kids in our criminal justice system. And so I would encourage you to think about how you think we should handle youth, what kind of punishments you think are appropriate for them to receive. And I hope that at some point we get to talk more about that one-on-one. So if anyone has any questions, I would be very happy to talk to you about those, answer any other, respond to any other thoughts that you have, and spend more time talking to you about this really important issue.